Hey everyone, what I'd like to do today is review the ZikeTech or ZikeTech USB4 NVMe SSD enclosure. This is the enclosure here, and the company kindly sent this out to me about 6 weeks ago, which I do appreciate. I do appreciate companies that support this channel, but it doesn't influence what I think or what I say to all of you. But this is the enclosure. This is what we're going to be talking about today in this video. And on the box here, you can see USB 4, 40 gigabits per second, PCI Express Gen 4x4. There's some other notes about the features on the back here, but it is worth noting that it has been out for about a year or so, but this is my first time using it. And the model number is the number of the beast. There you go, Z666. So that is the box, that is the enclosure, and what I'm going to be doing in this video is talking about pricing, features, the unboxing, installation, and I performed a lot of performance tests as well. So it's going to be a long-ish video, so feel free to jump to the part of the video which is relevant to you. Check the description area for the timeline. I'll also leave a link to my buddy David Harry's review of this enclosure. He published a really good review of this last month, and I do think for things like this, it's good to look at a few different videos to get different opinions and a different perspective from someone else. But what I'd like to do in this video is give you my opinion and my perspective. So without further ado, let's talk about the ZikeTech USB4 NVMe SSD enclosure. The ZikeDrive Z666 enclosure is available from the official ZikeTech website with free shipping and a delivery time of between 7 and 15 working days. It is difficult to say the exact retail price of the enclosure as Zike are always running promotions, but at the moment it's selling for around the $100 mark, which is around the same price or even cheaper than many alternative USB 4 enclosures. By entering my discount code, you can reduce the price by a further 20%. Here in the UK, that reduces the current price to £77.26. The enclosure is powered by the versatile ASM2464PD USB 4 controller. This is the same controller used in other USB 4 enclosures, including the OWC Express 1M2 that I own, and alternative solutions from Oracle, Satechi, and more. It's a driverless solution that works with Windows, Mac, and Linux. It also works with iPads and modern gaming consoles. The enclosure is compatible with USB 4, Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4, USB 3.2, Gen 1 and Gen 2, and USB 2. I had no issues with USB 4 and USB 3.2 connections, but I was not able to get great speeds using a Thunderbolt 3 connection, which is something I will speak about later in the video. ZikeTech claims read speeds of up to 3.8 gigabytes per second and write speeds of up to 3.2 gigabytes per second. I'll talk about my own results later in the video, but it's worth noting that ZikeTech's SSD compatibility table shows the Lexer NM790 SSD as being capable of 3.9 gigabytes per second for reading and 3.8 gigabytes per second for writing. Other SSDs, such as the Samsung 990, are showing slower results of around 3.1 gigabytes per second for reading and writing, which is not a big surprise as that is a high performance drive that runs hot. It's a reminder that many factors have to be considered when performing benchmarks, such as the computer performing the test, the SSD in the enclosure, thermals, and of course, the enclosure itself. The ZikeTech enclosure is a practical solution. It's small, has an aluminium design for cooling, and boasts its own built-in cable. 4 SSD form factors are supported, and you can add SSDs with capabilities up to a whopping 16 terabytes. The best thing about the whole design is that it is toolless, so it's very easy to install and change SSDs. The enclosure comes packaged in an easy-to-open box. At the bottom of the plastic container, you will find a nice half-meter Type-C to Type-C USB 4 cable. It's a braided cable which also has a useful cable tie attached. A short user manual is also provided to help you get started. At the other side of the container, you will find the ZikeDrive enclosure. The whole enclosure is designed with an aluminium alloy that wraps around it, but internally, you have the main compartment for the SSD and a side compartment for the stowaway cable. The enclosure is initially contained within a hard plastic see-through shell. My guess is that this is there to help provide extra protection for the enclosure when you're carrying it around, though I don't really see the point of it. The enclosure's aluminium shell already offers great protection, and as the aluminium shell helps dissipate heat, you wouldn't want to put the plastic shell on it when you're accessing the drive. I also found the plastic shell to be a pain to take off and put back on again, so for me, it's staying in the box. Once that plastic shell is off, you'll find the enclosure's toolless design a joy to use. You just need to pull the shell up at the side that says open and then slide the top part off. Without an SSD installed, I weighed the enclosure in at 186 grams, which is 6.6 ounces. For my performance tests, I installed the Seagate FireCuda 520 2TB drive. I also have one of these Gen 4 FireCuda SSDs installed in my Windows PC, where it can generate read and write speeds close to 5 GB per second. It's an old drive at this point, but with those speeds, it is more than enough for a USB4 enclosure. After inserting the SSD into the enclosure, I just had to rotate the rubber stopper to keep the SSD in place. The top of the enclosure, which you slide off, is where the thermal pad is placed. I do have some Arctic TP3 thermal pads, which I could have used with this enclosure, but the provided thermal pad is good quality, so I was happy to use it. So all that was left to do was remove the thermal pad's blue film and slide the top of the enclosure back on and push it down to secure it. SSDs are obviously very light, but it's worth noting that once I installed my SSD, which has a 2280 form factor, I weighed the enclosure in at 195 grams, which is 6.8 ounces. So I've showed you what's in the box and I've showed you how you can install an SSD in this enclosure, but I'd like to talk more about the design of it. Now, this comes with two cables. The main cable here is the one that you're probably going to use most of the time. It's a 50 centimeter cable, branded Zike. It's braided and it's got a nice cable tie. So it's a good length. It's okay. You can obviously buy a longer USB4 cable if you wish, but I think this is a nice little cable and it should do the job for most people. Of course, one of the selling points of this enclosure is that you get a second cable. You get two segments here, one for the stowaway cable, one section for the SSD, and this little section here, I think it is cool. I think it's useful to have a little cable like this that you can, just take with you in the move. You don't have to worry about throwing another cable in the bag. And you can actually put this in the other side as well. So you can put this in either side, and then you can see here, you just push this little nodule out and it pops out. Now, in some situations, that could be a lifesaver, if you forgot to bring a cable. But in some situations, it's kind of impractical. I'm not going to say unusable, but just impractical because, if you've got a laptop and it's a horizontal USB-C port, you've got no issues. But as you know, in many motherboards on Apple Mac Minis, Apple Studios, etc., the USB-C ports here are vertical. So what happens is, well, you can see here, I can't twist that. So what I need to do is put the whole enclosure vertically, but this doesn't have like a stand for that. And now we've got this situation where the Mac Mini is raised up for me to connect that. So you obviously wouldn't use the stowaway cable in that type of situation, with a little mini computer or a motherboard. So yeah, in situations like that, it's impractical, but you can use this with a laptop and you won't have any issues there. So you kind of have two compartments here. Oh, I've got that the wrong way around. You have two compartments here. You've got the compartment here with, I can get it in. You've got one compartment for the SSD here, one compartment for the cable. And there's a good argument that you could have made it smaller and just have this segment here. That would be the enclosure. But even with this extra section for the cable, this is still small. I mean, this is the OWC Express 1M2 that I've got, which has the same controller inside. And you can see that it's smaller. Even with that extra section for the cable, it's still a smaller enclosure. So it's quite practical. And one thing to note as well, you know, this is the Ugreen one that I've got. These two, obviously, they've got aluminium wrapping around it. It acts like a heat sink to dissipate heat. This one's got a fan in it, but that's a moving part that could fail. But one of the things to note is that to replace the SSD in here, you need to, you know, get the screwdrivers out. You've got one screw here with the Ugreen. Now, I'm not saying that's difficult to do. You just need a small screwdriver to change your SSD. And for most people, you install your SSD and you don't change it for perhaps even years at a time. But I do like the fact that this is toolless, because all you have to do here is just pop it open like that, and there you go. No screwdriver, no messing around. You don't have to do anything. You just pop that open. You've got a little rubber stopper there. Move that to the side, put in your SSD, and then you're good to go. And then it's the same, put it back on, just put it on like that, pop it on, good to go. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but it's nice that it's toolless. It's a nice design. You don't have to bring an extra cable if you don't want to. You don't have to bring a screwdriver. So if you are looking for an enclosure that you want to take around with you, something that you might take a few spare SSDs, depending on your needs. Perhaps you're a photographer or you do a lot of video editing, then maybe this is an enclosure that would be useful to you, because as you've seen there, you can just pop it open and change the SSD with ease. Overall though, I think it's a good design. I do like it. It's very portable, it's not too heavy, and I think it looks good as well. Let's talk about performance. Let's talk about the speed which you can get from an SSD inside this ZikeTech enclosure. Over the last few weeks, I performed a number of benchmarking tests with the enclosure, with my FireCuda 520 inside, connected to my M4 Mac Mini. Now, there's a few things to note. One is that the Seagate 520 is an older SSD at this point, but the maximum read and write speeds are higher than what USB4 can deliver, so it's still a good drive to use. And the other thing is that the two applications that I've used for speed results are Blackmagic's Disk Speed Test and Atto Disk Benchmark. Now, I am not an expert on what's going on in the background of these speed test applications. I mean, I do understand computing, I do understand what a lot of it means, but I don't understand why some applications are giving much different results in some situations. So it's hard to know which one is the most reliable result to use. But what I can say from my own experience is that the Blackmagic app sometimes has more erratic results going up and down. And that might represent what's actually going on with the SSD. But there has been a few situations over the last few months where I've used Blackmagic's app to test an SD card or a 10 gigabit per second enclosure, and the results show read and write speeds above what the drive can actually deliver. So sometimes the results seem to be a little bit wild or inaccurate, not all the time, but sometimes it seems to go away from what you would expect, which is why I personally favor the results from Atto a little bit more. But again, I'm not an expert, I'm just sharing my experience. The first performance test that I'd like to share with you was using the ZikeTech enclosure with the normal half-meter cable and the shorter stowaway cable, with the ZikeTech enclosure connected to the Type-C port at the front of the Apple Mac Mini, which can deliver up to 10 gigabits per second. With both of these cables, I got very similar results. With Blackmagic Design Disk Speed Test, I got around 890 megabytes per second for reading and around 970 to 980 megabytes per second for writing. With Atto Disk Benchmark, for reading, I got between 960 and 970 megabytes per second. And for writing, I got 1.02 gigabytes per second. So very similar results for both cables, yeah, and they kind of went up and down a little bit as you would expect during a few different tests, but the results were very similar with both of those cables. The next test I would like to share with you was with the ZikeTech enclosure connected to the USB4 port at the back of the Mac Mini. So we went from 10 gigabits per second up to 40 gigabits per second. And I used the normal cable, I used the shorter stowaway cable, and I also used a third cable, an alternative USB4 cable, just to see how it compared to both of these cables. Now, with these results, with the normal cable, I got 3.13 gigabytes per second writing for Blackmagic Design and 3.06 gigabytes per second reading. And for Atto Disk Benchmark, I got 3.29 gigabytes per second reading and 3.09 gigabytes per second writing. The results with the short cable and the alternative USB4 cable were slightly different for Blackmagic Design, with the read speeds dropping to about 3.01 or 3.02 gigabytes per second reading and 2.9 to 3.0 gigabytes per second writing. The Atto Disk Benchmark speed with those other cables were pretty much identical to the normal cable. 3.29 gigabytes per second reading, 3.06 gigabytes per second writing. So what can we take from that? Well, Atto is showing pretty much the exact same speed for the normal cable, the stowaway cable, and also the other USB4 cable, which I've got, and I use that with a USB4 enclosure that I've got, a Thunderbolt enclosure. So with all three cables, I was getting pretty much the exact same speed with Atto Disk Benchmark, but with Blackmagic Design, it was showing not a lot, but slightly slower read and write speeds for the stowaway cable and the other cable compared to the normal cable. So the results were not wildly different, really, and they're just a little bit slower, but I don't think there's any difference here between any of those cables. So with all of those results, with the 10 gigabit per second connection, with the USB4 connection, they're kind of what you would expect for that drive in a USB4 enclosure. So no issues from my end. Those speeds are more than acceptable. They're really impressive for an SSD like that through a USB4 enclosure. They are what you can expect through the Mac Mini and what I've seen from my other enclosures as well. So yeah, performance from that point of view with those tests seemed to be good. Another way to test the performance of an enclosure is to write to the files in the SSD. So I have a directory with 100.75 gigabytes of files. It's got lots of video files, lots of different directories, and I transferred that directory from my Mac Mini to the Zike enclosure here. And it managed to transfer all of those files in about 44 seconds. Now that works out to be about a speed of 2.29 gigabytes per second for writing. Now you might be wondering, why is that so much lower than what we got in the performance tests? Well, the reason for that is because of the limitation of my M4 Mac Mini. I've got the base model, and the SSD in that base model isn't the fastest. I've tested it using Atto Disk Benchmark, and my Mac Mini is showing write speeds of 1.72 gigabytes per second and read speeds of 2.34 gigabytes per second. So that's kind of the ceiling. 2.34 is the most that I can read from the Mac Mini, and I'm seeing 2.3 gigabytes per second when I'm transferring it over. So I got the results I expected transferring from the Mac Mini to the Zike enclosure, 2.3 gigabytes per second for writing. But I wanted to do another test. So I have that same directory, 100.75 gigabytes of storage of files, video files, etc. I put it on my OWC Express, and both of these were connected via a USB4 connection. And I've transferred that large directory from this enclosure to the ZikeTech enclosure, and it did manage to transfer all of those files over quicker. It transferred everything over in only 34 seconds, and that means that it's got a write speed of 2.96 gigabytes per second. So to summarize, when I transferred 100.75 gigabyte of storage from my OWC enclosure to my Zike enclosure there, I managed to transfer all of it in 34 seconds, and it transferred at a speed of 2.96 gigabytes per second writing, which is pretty much what I saw for a write speed with the Blackmagic design and the Atto benchmarking tests. So I was able to reproduce the results that I got in those apps, and I was able to do it in a practical real life situation. So that's very good to see. But it's not all perfect. I need to talk about the Thunderbolt 3 connection, and I need to talk about thermal throttling. What I'd like to do now is talk about compatibility using the ZikeDrive with different platforms, different devices. But then I'd like to specifically talk about a Thunderbolt 3 connection, because my experience of using a Thunderbolt 3 connection was not as good as I had hoped. I was not getting the speeds that I hoped for. But if you look on the website, you can see that the ZikeDrive works with any USB-C device, such as Mac, PC, iPad, PlayStation, PS5, Xbox, and more. You can connect using Thunderbolt 3 or 4, USB 2.0, USB 3.2, Gen 1 or 2, USB 4. In my previous tests, I formatted the ZikeDrive to the Apple file system, and I connected via USB 3.2 and then USB 4, 10 gigabits per second and 40 gigabits per second. Later, I connected it to my Windows computer, the PC, and my Dell XPS in the background there, and I reformatted it to NTFS, so the Windows file formatting system. Right now, I have reformatted it again to Apple's file system, because I want to quickly show you the ZikeDrive connected to my iPad Pro. And using this app here, you can see I've selected the ZikeDrive Z666, and if I bring this down and quickly say start, you'll see a very crude test where it's showing write speeds of just under 2 gigabytes per second and read speeds of 2.5 gigabytes per second. So this is a USB 4 connection with a USB 4 cable, and I don't know what the expectation is with USB 4 enclosures with the iPad Pro. I personally think that's quite good. I think for most situations, that's a very good connection speed. If you're doing file editing, if you're doing any kind of productive work, those speeds are good enough, I think, in most situations. I'm not sure what those results will be for other people in other situations with other SSDs, but I think that's okay. And I do think that you have to, when you're using different types of connections with different types of computers, maybe less powerful computers or, tablets, etc., you need to kind of give and take a little bit and be understanding that you might not get the exact same speed you would get with a powerful PC or a powerful Mac. You have to temper your expectations, I would say. But I think those speeds are quite good. I think those are acceptable. Let me know what you think about that. That's a very quick, crude test. Not sure how reliable it is, but I wanted to share it with you. Now, the website does say Thunderbolt 3 connection, and I want to talk about that because we're moving into the world of Thunderbolt 5. The last few years, most laptops and most PCs have came with Thunderbolt 4. But for a long time, Thunderbolt 3 was the standard. And a lot of people still opted for Thunderbolt 3 in some situations because the speeds, were the same. Thunderbolt 3 offered up to 40 gigabits per second. Now, with my PC, I connected the ZikeDrive Enclosure to my PC. And the first thing that I noticed was that on my PC, it did not show up in the Thunderbolt Control Center. Now, that's not a big problem, but I did notice it did not show up. But it did show up in disk management. It did show up in Windows Explorer, etc. But I was getting read and write speeds of 1 gigabytes per second, more or less. So that's way below the 3 gigabytes per second reading and writing, which I would have expected with a 40 gigabytes per second connection. I tried a few different cables. I tried the official USB 4 cable. I tried a few different Thunderbolt cables, and I got the same result. So with regards to that, I think that what that highlights is that I've got one of the earlier Thunderbolt 3 cards. I've got a Gigabyte Titan Ridge card. It's one of the older ones. There's not even been a driver update for a few years for it. So whilst this controller and this enclosure can support Thunderbolt 3, clearly with older Thunderbolt 3 cards and connections, you might not get the speeds that you desired. I'm not sure whose fault that is as far as it's an old device or the controller has not added, enough support for those older devices, but that explains maybe those bad results of only 1 gigabytes per second reading and writing. With my XPS 13, which you can see in the background there, it's still an old laptop at this point, but it's been supported longer and it has Thunderbolt 3 connections on it. And I got a little bit, better results, let's say. Firstly, it showed on the Thunderbolt Control Center, but I was still getting speeds of between 2 and 2.4 gigabytes per second for reading, and between 1 and 1.2 gigabytes per second for writing. So those speeds were still way below what I would expect for a 40 gigabits per second connection, a lot slower. I tried a few different cables, again, a few different Thunderbolt cables, a few different USB4 cables to see if that was a factor. And once again, it's hard for me to speak with confidence here that this is the fault of the enclosure. I'm not sure if it's the fault of the enclosure or not. I'm not sure. That XPS 13 is a few years old at this point, but I did expect to see better results than that. Now, if you look online, you'll see a lot of people talking about this. You'll see a lot of people talking about not just the ZikeDrive, but other enclosures with this controller. And they're talking about the fact that it's not working great with a Windows 10 or a Thunderbolt 3 connection. There's a lot of people posting it on Reddit. You can see here Titan Ridge, which is I've got Titan Ridge 2.0. I've got 1.0, which is even older, but it's a very similar PC setup that I've got. And they ran into similar problems where they were just not getting the speeds, etc., or it was not working at all. Now, I'm not saying any of this to say that this is not a Thunderbolt 3 compatible device. It clearly is. In every situation, even when it didn't show in Thunderbolt Control Center, Windows still saw the drive. I was still able to write to the drive. I was still able to read, but I was just not getting the speeds that I expected. So whilst this is Thunderbolt 3 compatible, I think you need to be realistic about the fact that Thunderbolt 3 at this point is an old standard, and the controller is maybe not offering the support that they should. They're saying it's Thunderbolt 3 compatible. It is. But you might be disappointed if you connect a Thunderbolt 3 card, a Thunderbolt 3 compatible laptop or PC, and you don't get the speeds that you would expect. So it seems to be very reliable with USB 4. I suspect Thunderbolt 4 as well. I don't have a connection for that to test, but I've got no doubts about a Thunderbolt 4 and a USB 4 connection is solid. But for older Thunderbolt 3 connections, you might be running into some issues. It's just something that you have to take into account with devices that are compatible with lots of different computers, lots of different platforms. You are going to see different results depending on the age of the computer that you're using. But anyway, that was my experience with the Thunderbolt 3 connection. You might be a little bit disappointed, but it still does connect. I guess that's something that you can take away. What I'd like to do now is talk about thermal throttling. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of what that is. That's when an SSD is not being cooled enough. So you see your read and write speeds dropping because it's not being cooled down enough. It's running hot. Now, if I show you these enclosures here, you can see these are the 3 USB 4 enclosures that I've got. And they all kind of work in a similar way. With the ZikeDrive here, you can see you've got the SSD, and that is being cooled by this thermal pad. And that's how all of these work. You've got a thermal pad on your SSD. And then behind that thermal pad, you have the case itself. And in each of these examples, the case is trying to dissipate the heat that's being transferred to the thermal pad, and then it's being dissipated through the case. Now, these two work in the same way in that there's no moving parts. This has a fan, but it will also dissipate heat. And the idea is that when you touch these, they will be hot because, it's dissipating the heat through the aluminium alloy. With the U-green here, it has a fan. And a lot of people support that because what it means is that you've got additional cooling for the SSD. You've got a fan spinning that's going to cool all of the components. It's going to dissipate the heat better. It's going to get rid of the heat. And that hopefully means that you're not going to get any throttling and you're going to get better speeds. Now, some people don't like having a moving part in their enclosure because things can go wrong. The fan can break. And some people have reported that the fan is very loud in this enclosure. My experience, it was super quiet, but some people did report that. But these two do work in the same way. SSD, thermal pad on top, and then you've got the enclosure, which dissipates the heat. Now, I'm talking about all of this because my buddy David Harry reviewed the ZikeDrive Enclosure, the ZikeTech Enclosure, a month or so ago, and it's a very, very detailed review. He goes into great detail. He transferred a lot of files, and one of the things he noticed was a thermal throttling issue. And you can see here, he did a lot of disk speed tests. He was testing, transferring files. He was doing speed tests, and he showed that the write speeds were greatly dropping. And he also did some temperature tests, and he was showing that the temperature was rising. He actually did a follow-up to this. I'll leave a link to both of these videos. I encourage you to check them out. And he compared the ZikeTech Enclosure to an Acasis one, and at a certain point, the Acasis one was not throttling when the ZikeTech was. So clearly there is something at play there, where with one enclosure cooling his drive and the ZikeTech was not. So I encourage you to check it out. It is important to look at someone else's opinion, someone else's perspective, and David was able to reproduce this thermal throttling issue. Now, the reason I'm saying he was able to reproduce it is because I did not have as much luck. Part of that is maybe because I did not do as extensive testing as David did. What I did was I did some speed tests with it, and I just kept doing speed tests, and then I transferred a lot of files. I probably transferred 500 to gigabyte to like a terabyte of files to the drive, and it was very hot at that point. Blackmagic Design was showing lower read and write speeds at that point. It was hot to touch, and I did see those read and write speeds going down. Now with Atto, despite the fact it was really hot and Blackmagic was showing slower results, Atto was not showing that. It was showing that the speeds, the write speeds, the read speeds were exactly the same. Now, again, I'm not an expert on these applications, what's going on in the background. Atto was showing everything was fine. Blackmagic was saying that it was a little bit slower. So it's one of those situations where I don't know which is right. David was using the Blackmagic app for his speed results. And like I said, I have in the past shown that that can be a little bit erratic, you know, giving you the wrong results. But in this instance, I was kind of leaning towards the Blackmagic app being more accurate because it was very hot and Atto was showing that everything was fine, but Blackmagic was showing that the results were going down. Thermal throttling is something that you have to be aware of, and you have to think about that when you're building your setup. In David's case, he was using a 4 terabyte Samsung 990 Pro, which is a Gen 4 SSD, which is very hot, and sometimes when you buy it from Samsung, you can get it with your own cooler so that it cools correctly. So it is a really fast SSD, and it has higher maximum read and write speeds than the FireCuda that I have here. So one factor, or what could be a factor, is that the SSD that David was using needs more cooling than the FireCuda drive that I have, which is maybe why I didn't see as much, you know, thermal throttling. I didn't see the speeds drop as much, maybe because this drive doesn't have to be as cooled as much as the Samsung. So that may be a factor, I don't know, but it is telling that David did the exact same test with his Samsung drive, with this enclosure and with another one, and the other one did not throttle the speeds. So it's something to be aware of. There's a lot of factors to consider as far as what SSD you're putting into your enclosure. I have no doubt that what David said is correct, that this can throttle your SSD, especially if you're using you know, a fast SSD that needs a lot of cooling. So that's something to be aware of. I wasn't able to reproduce the results that David got exactly because the results showed a slightly thermal throttling, but not with Atto. So maybe my tests were not good enough. But David did extensive tests. He got the thermal gun out. He did lots of transfers to figure out exactly what was going on. So I'll leave a link to both of his videos. Please do check it out, and please do bear in mind that thermal throttling could be an issue with this enclosure, particularly if you're using, you know, a certain SSD. Something to bear in mind of. And again, when I do all these tests, I'm just giving you my opinion and I'm reporting my own findings. But it's important to look at other people's perspective on this as well, especially there's so many configurations. That's, you know, there's so many configurations that you can have with these enclosures, different computers, different SSDs. So yeah, check out David's videos and check out some other reviews as well, so that you've got a good understanding as to how big that thermal throttling issue is. I hope you've all enjoyed this look at the ZikeTech or ZikeDrive USB4 NVMe SSD enclosure, model number Z or Z666, the number of the beast. So from a design perspective, I've been very impressed with this, and I can see the appeal of this enclosure for many different people. The included cable here, 1/2 meter cables, really nice. But one of the selling points of this is that it's portable, it's lightweight, and you've got this little stowaway cable. Now, I know that maybe looks a bit gimmicky, but I think that's a nice little addition to the enclosure because it means that you've always got a cable there. Very easy to pop in, to pop out. The downside to it is that it's very short and therefore doesn't really twist, which means that if you've got a vertical USB Type-C port, you kind of have to stand this enclosure vertically as well. Just something to be aware of, not a deal breaker. But it is nice that you've got that little cable at the side. And I do like the fact that this is so easy to pop open and change the SSD. So if you're looking for an enclosure for traveling and you think you're going to be taking a few different SSDs, then this is a good solution for that because you can quickly change SSDs. No screwdrivers, no messing around, just quickly change it. Very easy to do. As far as compatibility goes, I tested this on the Mac Mini, tested it on my Windows computer, I tested it on my iPad Pro. With the iPad Pro, with the Apple Mac Mini, USB 4, USB 3.2, no issues at all. Very, very good connection speeds in my opinion, what I would expect for each of those connections. So I was very happy with it. But from a compatibility point of view, you have to be aware that if you've got an older PC or an older laptop with Thunderbolt 3, you might see the same results that I did. And with Thunderbolt 3, I mean, my PC has a Thunderbolt 3 card, but the driver has not been updated for years because they haven't released a driver. They've released new versions of the card. Same with my laptop. It's an older laptop at this point with a Thunderbolt 3 connection, which perhaps explains why the read and write speeds were not as what I expected. In theory, I should have been getting the same speeds as a USB 4 connection because it does have a 48 gigabit per second connection. So I should have been seeing like 3 gigabytes per second reading and writing, but I did not. And whether that compatibility issue is because of the USB 4 controller in here or whether it's because of the older devices not being updated, I don't know. I don't know who to blame for this. It could be, whoever's responsible for your Thunderbolt 3 controller not being updated to support this, but I don't know. But the reality is that if you do connect this to a Thunderbolt 3 port, chances are you're going to see the same issue that I did, and you'll see reduced speeds, reduced read and write speeds. It's still compatible, it will still work, it will still connect, you can still use it and transfer files, but you might be a little bit disappointed with the performance. The other negative that I pointed out in this video is thermal throttling, which is something that does affect many USB SSD enclosures, and it is something which the ZikeTech enclosure seems to have trouble with as well. This was something that was highlighted by my buddy David Harry. He did extensive tests on this, and he showed repeatedly in many different tests that when you do have this on for a long time, when you're transferring files and it starts to get hot, it really isn't cooling the SSD enough. It's not dissipating the heat enough, and those read and write speeds are being dropped. Now, I could not reproduce exactly what he saw. And I think part of the reason is because I'm using a slower SSD. I mean, it's an SSD that's still fast enough for this enclosure, but the drive that he's got does run a little bit hotter. And it seems like this enclosure just can't seem to handle that. And it can't seem to cool it as much, which is maybe why when I did my stress test, the speeds did not drop as much as what they did on his. But they did drop a little bit, at least on the Black Magic speed test. It did show that the read and write speeds were dropping. So it is something to be aware of. On that subject of thermal throttling, if you're buying an enclosure like this and you're basically buying it to quickly transfer some files, plug it in, transfer 100 gigabyte, 200 gigabytes of files, and then disconnect it, I don't think the thermal throttling is an issue at all. You're not going to really see any performance being hit. You're not going to see those reduced speeds because of thermal issues because you're just transferring the files quickly, and then when you disconnect, this will cool down. But if you're connecting a drive for hours, there is a very good argument for, rather than going for something like this, you go for an enclosure which has a fan. And David showed that in his video, that the enclosure with the fan was much better at cooling the drive over a long period of time, ensuring that you get sustained reading and writing speeds and they're not dropping down. Now, to play devil's advocate, if you've got a fan, there is always the risk of the fan breaking. And this has been great for me, this Ugreen one. No issues at all as far as noise, as far as the fan breaking. But a lot of people online have reported that the fan broke, and I've seen similar comments with the Acasis enclosure as well, that the fan broke. I mean, it's just computing. If you've got a fan, there's always a risk of something breaking. That being said, if you're connecting a drive for hours at a time, I think the one with the fan is the one to go with. You have to be aware of the thermal issues that can arise, especially if you're using a very fast SSD that needs a lot of cooling. You might run into some issues with this one. But again, check out David's video. He will speak more about that issue than I have. He's got a dedicated video about it, so check it out to learn more about the thermal throttling issues. At this point, I'd like to put it over to you guys. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please do click the like button, hit subscribe. If you've got any questions about any of this, or would like to give some feedback on it, please do leave a comment below. And until next time, take care.